You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to yet another episode of Radio MMT. How are you this week, Anne?
I'm good. Hello, Kevin. Hello to our lovely listener. Thank you for joining us for another hour as we wend our way through the wonderful thing called the economy.
We're getting back to our roots here, Anne. We're getting back to
we are, aren't we?
Talking about unemployment, which is how you and I first started our radio show on Unemployed Workers Fight Back. But it's also, as we said last time, it's the foundation of the economy. However your unemployment is looking, it's a it's a litmus. It's an indication of the rest of the economy, you know.
It is, isn't it? It's like the pulse of the economy, how well the patient's doing.
I've been saying this for years, and other people say it as well. You know, people always talk about measuring how your society is doing by looking at the richest people in your society. That's not a proper indicator. If you want to have a look at your society, you see how the poorest people in your economy are going, and if they're all right, then your economy's all right. And if they're not, then we need to fix things.
Yes.
Yeah, we need to fix things. Yeah.
Well, we're going to hear about how to fix things today. We are returning to the second half of a conversation that you and I had with Martha Knox-Haley and John Haley, who are this dynamic husband and wife duo who we met indirectly via the economics course run by Stephen Hale and Co. at Modern Money Lab.
But they've done a heap of things, though. You spring these people on me, Anne, I don't know who they are, and they're really qualified. They really know what they're talking about, and they've got stats and figures, and they've done stuff. Oh, yes, indeed. Now, the last episode we did,
we looked at how unemployment is a scourge on society, and yet the federal government, central bankers and corporations insist on keeping people unemployed. And we also looked at how Australia has a broken labour market, broken by decades of neoliberal policy. So in Australia, we have tens of thousands of unemployed people, yet at the same time, we have employers complaining loudly that they can't find suitable workers within Australia. So it's really interesting to learn that the same policies that harm the economy by creating skills shortages, it also harms individuals. And in this episode, we will continue our conversation with John and Martha, and we'll look at the effects of unemployment on the individual. And this in itself should be enough to motivate us to find a different way to manage the economy. And of course, there is a better way. And John outlines the kinds of things that we could and should do to have a full employment economy. And of course, Kevin, we're always coming from our MMT perspective, which is that once we understand the huge capacity that the federal government, which is a sovereign currency issuer, that it has, then we can start demanding that it uses that power of the public purse in the name of the public good.
Yeah, it's all about understanding where money comes from, how it's created, and its intersection with real resources. So once you understand where money comes from, who makes it, how much they've got, which is as much as you need, then these conversations become a lot more nuanced. I think we start this interview with Martha reflecting on some of the plight of the unemployed.
When we look at data, and this comes from the 15 European Union countries, it comes from the US, it comes from the UK, it comes from Australia, it comes from Canada. What we find is that unemployment indisputably reduces well-being, and that leads to people becoming trapped in a cycle of unemployment and poor well-being. What we also have is a relationship between sense of purpose and what is known as all-cause mortality. What we find with German studies is that the long-term unemployed have at least a twofold higher risk of mental illness. We find with Swedish studies that respondents are 23.6 times more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety. And their mortality is 1.6-fold higher. And the way that this actually converts is that they have a greater risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. They have a greater risk of suicide. So this is literally killing people.
Right. This is government policy killing people.
Yeah, this is keeping people unemployed literally leads to people dying. Now, we know that when people are put under stress, that they will have an elevated inflammatory response, an inflammatory tissue response, because the body is mobilizing to signs that threat is imminent in an environment. Now, when you have chronic stress, i.e., chronic long-term unemployment, what they found through Finnish research was that the long-term unemployed have a 5-fold increased inflammatory response. And this gets back to why we've got higher mortality rates amongst the unemployed. What that means is they're at greater risk of developing cancer, they're at greater risk of developing arthritis, they're at greater risk of developing cardiovascular diseases. So this, at a micro level, is how this stuff is playing out. Now, going back up to the macro, the problem that we've got with the Reserve Bank executive is that they're dyed-in-the-wool, neoclassically trained economists. So we've got the wrong people at the top making these recommendations about what should happen with inflation and money relationships. We're using the wrong tools, i.e. the Nehru, to conceptualise inflation. Our understanding of what causes inflation is back to front. We're conceptualising it as caused by inflation of wages. It's not. It's actually a supply side issue. We are misunderstanding the priority of what a job actually means in our society. We are thinking of it as just purely income-based, and the longitudinal household data that comes out of Britain demonstrates that unemployment has greater effects than just loss of income. It is related to a whole series of psychosocial variables such as loss of social connection. Human beings are designed for social connection. When we are socially isolated, we get sick.
That's how you punish people, actually.
Well, this is exactly right. And unemployment puts people into a process of isolation, which is why we need a job guarantee rather than universal basic income, because a job guarantee gives us things like social connection. It gives us purpose. We know that when people don't have purpose, they have higher mortality rates. It's why a job guarantee is needed to actually preserve skills, which we need to have preserved so that Australia can make the transition to this new sustainable economy. there's so many levels at which the job guarantee impacts the way that this country will function as a success or whether it will deteriorate.
I have heard that with unemployment, unlike other adverse life circumstances, for example, like the death of a family member or relocation or something like that, people don't adjust to being unemployed. In other words, where your well-being levels come back up.
That's exactly right. So again, the longitudinal data shows that you have a period of 3 weeks where you've got a honeymoon period where people kind of enjoy being at leisure. And then after that 3 weeks, from 3 weeks to 6 months, their psychological health deteriorates, and it deteriorates quite sharply. And then from 6 to 9 months, you have a further more gradual deterioration in psychological health. But it doesn't come back up because people need structure for their day. A job gives you that structure. They need social connection. A job gives you social connection. They need purpose. A job gives you that. They need a sense of traction, goals, focus, the opportunity to deploy skills. A job is a very, provided it's a good job, and job guarantee policy needs to generate good jobs. So there needs to be an element of vocational counselling in here and looking at what are people's talents, what are their skills, what do they want to do, what do they regard as meaningful, because that's very individually shaped as well. So this is why a job guarantee is so critical, but it's also so critical that we do this in the context of introducing MMT-informed economic policies.
I have to admit, Kevin, that in past times when I have heard people like Martha waxing lyrical about the non-monetary benefits of having a job, I used to think they were overdoing it a bit, because I can remember plenty of times when it felt like my job had a whole lot of detrimental effects. And, I figured that I could find plenty of things to occupy myself. But then I realised that what I was occupying myself with was a lot of voluntary work, which sort of gives you the same benefits as paid work, except without the money.
Yeah, I guess the thing to realise, and this is where we touch on the argument with the people who support the universal basic income, we're not monetary creatures, we're social creatures. We don't need money, we need contact.
Yeah, when we were talking about how you don't adjust psychologically to the status of being unemployed, and one thing is I have heard that it is so demonised and it's such a low status position that if you're unemployed, it's a continual reminder that you have no value to society. Like, it's just this repeated exercise in being devalued by the people around you. They look at you like you're bludging or something.
Yeah, it's a pretty shallow sort of way of viewing people. There's a need for people to feel useful, and there's a need for people to interact with other people. And that can be done in many ways, but more often than not, it's done through work in our society. And it's just a question of finding better ways of working, trying to remove the mundane, mechanical, industrial jobs and replacing them with more human jobs. And this is where the care economy comes in. We've got all sorts of people in our society who need looking after and helping. And I think the NDIS is kind of heading down, for me, a job guarantee-esque kind of work, where we have lots of people in our community being paid to look after other people in our community who need a bit of help.
Yeah, there's potential there for a caring economy. I mean, I'm not so sure that repetitive work is the problem. I think dangerous and dirty work, as they say, you might want to replace. But I've seen people get a lot of meaning out of what other people might think is mundane work.
Depends how it goes. I've done plenty of mundane work in my time. I remember once there was a little factory down the end of my street when I was living in Mudgee, and they made Rode microphones, which are Australian microphones. I'm an AV guy, and I thought, oh, wow, I have to go and check that out. Essentially what they had were a couple of machines that these were computerized industrial lathes, and I'd feed in bits of pipe and they'd make the outer shells for these microphones. So what I thought would be a really kind of interesting job turned into this very industrial job, and it was noisy. And there's about 3 people working there, so you've got the earmuffs on so that they can't talk to anybody.
Not a whole lot of social contact in that job.
I'm just doing the same thing day after day after day. And
yes.
I struggle with that. There was another guy there who said he had a 7-year plan and he was doing the same thing. And I just thought, you'd need a mental discipline that I don't have, or access to a whole bunch of podcasts like this one.
That's like what Martha was saying, that you tailor jobs to the individual's aptitudes and skills, and a good job can mean different things to different people.
Yeah, some people don't like other people. They like to just just do a task uninterrupted, do it very well, say hello to somebody over coffee.
I'm laughing a bit because I can recognise that.
So that's good. So, so maybe you've got an antisocial person, you give them one of those jobs and they can have a cup of coffee with you and then go back to their job, which is probably how this other guy was a bit. That's fine. Horses for courses. Yeah. So,
all right. Well, let's get back to some sensible conversation with...
Now, this is John talking about full employment policies. So there's talk about the job guarantee being an essential ingredient of a good economy. But John explains that this needs to be done in a greater framework of full employment policies. The job guarantee by itself is going to struggle, that it needs support. So in this next part of the interview, we hear John talking about these matters.
You're very thoroughly going through decades in the making of a broken labour market, and then one of the outcomes of that, of course, is a level of unemployment. And just to go back to that idea that, John, you were laying the blame squarely at the feet of government.
Mm-hmm.
You did have a bit to say about the Labor government's so-called Job Summit of September 2022. And this was held about 4 months after Labor came to power federally, and it was about a year after the end of the pandemic lockdowns. Now, my impression of the Job Summit was that it was simply about restoring access to skilled and unskilled migrant labour. But what did you see going on there?
Well, they did make a number of TAFE courses freely available to people, but it was a limited number, and we live in a country which can issue their own currency and can pay for education. So they make minor improvements, but they never follow through with their policy. If you're going to make TAFE free, then why not make all the TAFE free, like multiple European countries do?
Right.
Why do this partial fix and don't follow through on principle? And the summit was a lot about that. It was about enabling access to more immigrants, which bring in skills, which if we'd bothered to make available education to Australians would be absolutely unnecessary.
So we've talked about the truly horrendous psychological and social and even industrial and job market costs to the way we're managing our labour market, and the high unemployment that comes with how we currently manage the labour market. Now, we from the MMT community, we think we've got the solution. So, John, why don't you go ahead and explain why you think the job guarantee will be so superior?
A job guarantee has been trialled in Argentina. They implemented this sort of job guarantee in which they provided 5% of the rural community with paid work, working in their local communities. During that time, between 2002 and 2005, the Argentinian economy had the highest growth in the Western world. It was even marginally higher than China's.
That's amazing.
It wasn't a full-blown job guarantee. They didn't have a commitment to full employment.
Right.
But despite all the failings, it had a huge effect on the economy. What screwed it up was, of course, the Americans. Yes, and you know what happened in 2007.
Ah, yes.
Yes, the global financial crisis, and that just screwed everything. But for a short time there, because they ran this job guarantee, and it wasn't entirely down to the job guarantee, there also was a very strong export market. And those two factors resulted in one of the best economies in the world at the time.
So Argentina is such a good example then of showing that even if you don't have a suite of full employment policies, which we'd like the job guarantee to be sitting within, even if you just go and plunk a constrained job guarantee in there, you will still see quite impressive beneficial effects on the total economy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wrote an article which I called Positing Job Guarantee Antecedents, which basically goes through the entire idea of what you need to do before you do a job guarantee, which you need to bring in full employment policies, the sort of full employment policies that Curtin and Menzies and Ben Chifley, and for a short while even Whitlam, committed their governments to. When you've got full employment policies, then basically that 1.5% of people for which there is no work in the public service, etc., will have things to do. The idea is that the local community creates that job. It's funded by the government, but the local community comes to you and says, what will keep you occupied? We're a community of people. We will develop jobs that you can do. In the meantime, what we will provide for you while you're doing this job guarantee is, because we have a commitment to full employment policies, we will provide you with training. You're fixing up the local playground, you're planting some plants, you're doing that for a couple of hours, and then you're going off to do your training in quantum mechanics, because that's the area you're really fascinated with. Okay, I'm probably stretching that analogy just a little.
Right.
You know, the thing is that you're providing, on top of a guarantee, full employment policies. Job guarantee doesn't work by itself unless you have a commitment to full employment.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because, you know, you were talking earlier about how we've destroyed our vocational education sector.
Yes.
And I was wondering, well, how does a job guarantee deal with that? Because maybe...
It doesn't.
Exactly.
It doesn't.
Right.
A job guarantee is not there to provide those things for you. Full employment policies are there to provide those things for you. If you don't have full employment policies, there is no point to you doing a job guarantee.
Can I ask about what seems to be an apparent contradiction? Because Martha is saying that the jobs that we create in a job guarantee, we want those jobs to be meaningful and potentially part of a whole vocational approach. And yet we're not wanting people to stay there compared to being employed by either, I suppose, the public service and the private sector. So how do you make the jobs meaningful and yet also not so enticing that you'd want to stay there?
Well, you're basically only earning a minimum wage. You're redefining what is dominantly recognised as a job. You're doing things in the community where you may be helping stuff that we currently expect volunteers to do. But you're actually saying, well, you would volunteer to do X anyhow, we're going to pay you. And you say, thank you very much, that was wonderful. But, you know, the moment someone comes up with an interesting job, I'm out of here. And in a society that is, as we have been since about 2016, in and out of per capita recessions. I know we only seem to think that full recessions count, but per capita recessions means that basically the people on the ground level, the working class, are deprived.
I never heard that phrase, per capita recessions. That means that you're having a reduction in your income.
Yes.
I guess if you're looking at GDP, there's GDP and then there's per capita GDP,
Yes.
and it ties into the same sort of thinking. How does it relate to the individual? Yeah.
So if you are part of a job guarantee, you're willing and able to work for a living wage, which is just a minimum wage. You're not competing with the private sector.
Right.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
You were mentioning that unemployment rates are higher in the region. So you were mentioning that location can be a problem for unemployed people. And I was wondering, how would you overcome that?
Even if you could, transport all the people to the right places, give them all the skills they need, dress them nicely. If you did all of these other things, there just aren't enough jobs in the market. They just don't exist. So you've got to boost the public sector. You have to have a commitment to full employment. And then the 1 or maybe 2% that are left, you fill with a job guarantee.
Right. So to reinvigorate your regional towns and even the rural, you really need that federal government spending then.
Yes, you need the federal government spending. Instead of saying, oh, we're taking money away from the private sector by creating a surplus for the government sector. It's an accounting identity. If you have a surplus in the government sector, you have a deficit in the private sector. The only other area that you can have counterbalancing surpluses and deficits is in the foreign sector.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, if the government is spending into the economy, which it can afford to do, as long as there are resources, and given you've got 1.3 million people unemployed, you have resources. There is no shortage of resources. It can spend more money. It can deficit spend into the economy, put more money into the economy, build infrastructure, build full employment policies, build public sector employment, as was done by Barnaby Joyce by moving an entire department out to rural areas. It actually invigorated a rural area.
That's how you do it.
That's how you do it. You do that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we live in a world where we've just survived a pandemic where everyone realizes you can work from home. I mean, I've worked in the IT sector for donkey's years. We've been able to do work from home for decades, but no one wanted to trust their employees to do it, despite the fact that we discovered that during the pandemic, people were more productive working at home. Productivity boosted because they were working from home. They're working from an environment where they're far more comfortable. I used to take home one of those huge modems, it went...
Oh, yes.
and you're connected to your computer, and I would just, work from home.
Ah, yes. You were the avant-garde of work from home.
Yeah, we were. But this is all about real estate. This is all about maintaining real estate markets that sell off office space.
I never thought of that.
And this is creating a panic in the real estate market.
Yeah, that's a great example of a misallocation of resources. How much better it would be to house everyone comfortably and upgrade our homes to be thermally efficient and so on, instead of just building a whole lot of office spaces in the city.
But there is a functional use to having people in, because as Martha has already mentioned, human contact is necessary.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the other side of it.
Sitting at home, working on your thing is very isolating. You get into the same sort of issues of being unemployed because you lack social contact. So there is a reason to come into the office.
So maybe there's a happy medium there somewhere.
Yes.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us. Now, Kevin, I did get a little bit confused in that conversation about whether or not you do want to try implementing a job guarantee with other full employment policies, because the example of Argentina kind of showed that it sort of worked to have just a job guarantee.
This is where we get into the very tricky area of how do we implement a job guarantee. And if you've ever been to an MMT group conversation about job guarantees, everybody's got different ideas. Everybody's got 1,000 ideas. And I'm pretty sure that a working group on a job guarantee would have some robust discussion, you know. And so we're treading into this territory of complicating it. However, I think John's observations are certainly worthy of discussion and consideration.
Well, I think these nitty-gritties are definitely worth thinking about, either at the pub or somewhere else, because if we do start campaigning for a job guarantee, we're going to want to understand the effects of what we're demanding, you know, how a job guarantee might sit in relation to other policies.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's going to be a huge struggle because we will need to simply educate people about what a job guarantee is and how it's so much more vital to an economy than just giving people a basic income. So we're going to be educating people about how a monetary system works and to make the case that a job guarantee isn't just another form of worker exploitation.
This kind of falls into the area of do we need to educate them or do we just do it to them? Like, it's sometimes trying to explain things to people.
Bit of top down, do you reckon?
Well, you're trying to explain to people, and you just end up in these endless conversations. Have you ever watched this show Letterkenny, which is on SBS?
Okay.
It's about these tough groups, and they always end up fighting. They physically fight. But there's one particular group, and they'll start a conversation, and the other group will start talking back, and they end up with this backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And the other group says, well, we're just here to fight. And they go, yeah, we know we are. That's what we're talking to you about. And he goes, well, let's stop talking and let's start fighting. They go, okay, well, you start fighting. So my point being is that if you engage in the conversation, you could possibly get nothing done.
So what you're saying, we should go straight for taking on the capitalists and the mainstream economists who pervade the Treasury and the central bank and are convinced that we need high unemployment.
This is kind of where I reckon the NDIS is interesting. For me, it's treading on job guarantee territory. Sometimes I wonder whether there's people in the ALP who are making these policies who kind of realise that this is what we're trying to achieve, but you can't call it a job guarantee.
Right.
So you kind of stealth it in. You sneak it in, and then people go, you can't do that. And you go, well, we've been doing it for ages. Look at the NDIS.
That's Kevin's other strategy, job guarantee by stealth. I love it.
Just sneak it in, yeah. and then people get used to it just by mistake. So,
okay, back to our sensible conversation,
That's
Kevin.
a very sensible conversation.
With John and Martha.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier that a job guarantee ought to sit within full employment policy. So I was just wondering if you could give us a quick overview of what do we mean by full employment, first of all, and what do we mean by full employment policies?
Well, you've got to look at the solutions the Job Summit should have come up with.
Mm-hmm.
We ought to be restoring and widening the scope of public service, of taxation, of health, of education, of industrial relations departments, instead of deteriorating the public service, which Abbott did, destroyed about 10% of the public service. They destroyed the taxation department by taking people out who had expertise, who then went to the private sector, who then told oligarchs how they could avoid the tax. And we got the scandal that occurred with one of the accounting companies in relation to that. We ought to be reviewing agricultural policies which subsidise agricultural employment. So we need to maintain viable, essential food security that attracts Australians to farms. There's a whole story about all the nonsense that was coming out about farmers not being able to attract Australians into pulling up crops.
Look, it's really disappointing to see Australians refusing to work. That's what's happening now. Farmers are crying out for fruit pickers as our agricultural heartlands struggle to secure workers. I got so excited I mispronounced that. Now, the problem right now in this country is that well before COVID, we were developing an unhealthy welfare dependency. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Young Australians should be conscripted for a year, call it a gap year, call it whatever you like, and be forced to work on farms to supplement their welfare. They can then understand what a work ethic is all about. Well, joining me now to discuss this topic and many others is One Nation leader Pauline Hanson. Pauline, Queensland farmers are pleading with people on JobSeeker to become fruit pickers. Crops are being left to rot while the unemployment rate soars. Are we breeding a nation of bludgers?
Of course we are, Peter. And we know that we are breeding a nation of bludgers and people that are third and fourth generation on the welfare system. And I'm encouraging the government to come down hard on these people, that if you're not prepared to go out there and take the job on, when you've offered a job and for no good reason at all, then I'm sorry, you shouldn't get any assistance from the taxpayers.
Because it's not the government, it is actually your neighbours, your family, your friends, everyone else that is actually paying for you to
and the way that farmers took advantage of people who went there to work, came away with very little in terms of savings because they charged them for their accommodations.
Yes.
So we subject those people to annual reviews of employment conditions. We ought to be nationalising private employment agencies. This whole idea of privatising employment agencies has been a complete disaster. The only one that's earning any money out of that is the private employment agencies because they are heavily subsidised by the government. So we ought to be nationalising them. We need to end TAFE and university education fees. We need to facilitate a more highly educated public that can reduce the growing professional job vacancies. Managers, professionals and technicians are basically half the job market. The real growth in the market is in the highly technical jobs. You need to end educational fees. You know, Scandinavia can do it, Europe can do it. We're a bigger economy.
And we used to do it once upon a time.
And we used to do it. These are full employment policies. This isn't job guarantee. We need to establish technically based career paths so that when you're on the job guarantee, you have access to the training and some entry-level positions that you can move through. You've got to demonstrate to the government that as a private employer, you have a career path mechanism through which the mail clerk can one day become the CEO. We need to return to a centralised wage fixing.
Oh, okay.
What existed in the 1970s prior to Hayden and Whitlam starting to dismantle that, and certainly dismantling it by the time we had Hawke and Keating in management.
Why would a healthy wage structure promote full employment?
Well, centralised wage fixing ensures that wages are paid at a reasonable level for the jobs. If you have a centralised wage system, people know what they've got and they need to budget for that. So you have better structured businesses. If you have better structured businesses, you have a better structured economy. And a better structured economy works better because the people are on top of what they need to do in order to employ people to say, well, I need to be able to pay them this much. I need to be making a profit margin of X in order to do that, in order to generate production of goods and services in the market, rather than leaving it up to the sort of Howard-type enterprise agreements, rather than this ad hoc sort of, I think I need X person, but I don't want to pay them much.
Right. I heard someone recently say that the other thing about a full employment economy is it creates better managers.
Yes.
Because you actually have to run a good shop in order to entice workers.
Yes. Because they get away with exploiting workers, which brings us to the decrease in the exploitation of migrant labour by basically increasing random fair work inspectors of workplaces.
Oh, great.
You have inspections of workplaces that walk in there and say, you are underpaying your migrant labourers. You shouldn't be doing this. Here's your fine. If you're exploiting these people and you're underpaying them, you shouldn't be in business. It's all about having properly structured businesses.
Because that underpaying of migrant labourers, it hurts all workers.
Yes. Basically, you're then fighting for the lowest common denominator. You're basically fighting wages that are under the minimum wage because that's all that's available. you as an Australian trying to find a job with a decent pay, you got no chance at all.
So we're not being anti-business. We're being pro fair and healthy business.
Fair and reasonable businesses. So you also want to expand cadetships and apprenticeships. None of this CBT thing that I talked about before. You want full apprenticeships, which of course requires you to have graduate programs in the public service departments, so that you do your 3 and 4 year, plumbing apprenticeship, and you can walk out to Sydney Water and say, I can install John Haley's Hydroloop, which is the second in Australia, because we have the expertise to do all this plumbing, but they don't have the plumbing expertise because we don't have proper cadetships and apprenticeships in this country. We need to end costly public-private partnerships. They're expensive.
Yep.
They end up being more costly than the public service. We need public sector expertise and develop it fully. There are things that should be nationalised. Sometimes these projects are run by a state government level. They shouldn't be run at state government level. They should be run at federal government level because they issue money, whereas for the state has to rely on taxes, incomes, because they are users of money, not issuers of it.
Right.
Just like any individual or private enterprise, they are users of money. So these sorts of things need to be federally and publicly funded. They shouldn't be relying on the states, unless, of course, the federal government is fully subsidising or funding the state to do it. In the same way that you manage a job guarantee locally at a municipal level, but you fund it publicly. So the other thing that you need to be doing is a federal job guarantee, which is linked to career paths. Because you're looking at moving people out of a job guarantee onto a career path. So you need to provide education, apprenticeships, and an environment where full employment in the public sector or the private sector is available. And then the last thing, basically a Green New Deal, because we need to transition to energy and transport infrastructure that is wholly returned to the public sector and is driven by renewables. Renewables are doing fabulously at the moment in Australia, but you have a situation in Australia where there is power being generated, or power potentially to be generated from renewables, that they're not putting onto the grid. If we actually took all of the renewable energy that we can potentially create in this country already today, not tomorrow, today, there would be less need for generation of power from coal and gas, which is highly inefficient anyhow.
Kevin, what I took from John's 11 points on how to get to a full employment economy was that a full employment economy is not just an economy with zero involuntary unemployment. A full employment economy is an economy that is the foundation of a well-being economy, and it also has the potential to be the foundation for decarbonising the economy and for degrowing the economy, and for getting back to within these planetary boundaries that we're currently barrelling through. In other words, for a just transition.
Yeah, well, there's this constant banging on about growth, growth. And the only people that are really banging on about growth are the owners of industry, the few who are taking the most. And they need this exponential growth to keep on tracking their wealth like they have been. I reckon if we entered a degrowth economy and people's well-being was being serviced and improved, they wouldn't give two hoots about growth. Like if they're working less, if they've got a better work-life balance, if the environment is improving, if
secure housing and knowing that they don't have to worry about getting sick or having an accident, that they won't be looked after.
Yeah, do you think people would really care about GDP growth if their lives were improving anyway?
Do you think they care now?
Well, they do, because they keep on getting it shoved down their throats. But
Right.
They're told that they should be worried.
So a full employment economy might inoculate us against all this growth propaganda.
Well, yeah, we've been fed this rubbish for such a long time, the indicators of what's required for a successful economy. So if you could relieve people of that burden, that stress, I think they'd heave a huge sigh of relief.
So what else did you get out of John's 11 points there?
Well, okay, for the first thing, as I only counted 9, and it might be it might be that there were 2 points in one because I was paying attention.
How many did I get? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I got 11.
You got 11. Okay. Well,
Public service, agriculture, privatised employment services.
Are you going to edit that out or are you going to leave that in?
I don't know. Public-private partnerships, job guarantee and Green New Deal, 11.
Okay, so the first one was broadening the public service, and
right,
that's a no-brainer. Broaden the public service because if you're going to run things like job guarantees and have all of these public programs, you need a bigger public service. And the whole push to shrink the public service is just pure neoliberalism, saying that we need less government, and it's just rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a no-brainer. Broaden the public service. What was the next one? To do with agriculture?
Yeah, it was ensuring food security by an agricultural system that does not exploit workers.
Yeah, just bringing workers to where they're needed and making sure that they're properly looked after. That seems like a bit of a no-brainer. This is the thing about these things. There's nothing radical here. It's all just common sense. And
just common sense, isn't it?
Yeah. After that, did we have something about nationalising employment services?
Yeah, so, getting rid of this whole fake industry that's called the employment services, where people who are unemployed are required to go and have these appointments that are not going to help them get work. And in fact, all this industry does is it's actually a compliance industry to ensure that unemployed workers are obeying things like these job search requirements, which just annoy employers.
Yeah, and as we've heard in a previous part of the interview, there's a lot of people who are just overloading the system with these bogus kind of job applications because they have to provide them, even though there's no hope of them getting a job, just so they can tick boxes. Scrap all this nonsense, and anybody that's old enough will remember the
CES.
The CES. The CES was simple, and I was unemployed back in the day, and I'd walk into the CES and there'd be a job on the board. You'd walk around, there'd be all these little cards on these job boards, and they go, rightio, somebody's needed over here. And so I'd rock off and do that. It might be an afternoon's work, which might lead to a couple of days' work, which might lead to a job.
I love that pre-digital technology. It actually helped people find work.
Yeah, it was good. And the only reason that we have all of these private employment agencies is because, again, neoliberalism says that everything has to be privatised. Well,
and we have to punish unemployed people.
Yeah, so they've engaged all of these private agencies to make it as difficult as they can for people who are unemployed, and the only employment that has come out of this is the rorts by the employment agencies themselves. So they can go. That's a bit of a no-brainer. What have you got as the next one after that?
Free tertiary and vocational education.
We have all these skill shortages at the moment, and that is a result of local employment being sacrificed to imported labour. I don't have a problem with per se, except that was all done primarily under Howard to put downward pressure on wages.
Yeah, it's important to point out, isn't it, that you're not anti-migrant labour, but you're anti-pitting migrant labour against local labour.
Yeah, it's a very important distinction. So you stop training up your local population, you import those people to do those jobs.
You're importing your unskilled and your skilled labour.
Yeah, and that puts downward pressure on wages. It's kind of a no-brainer. If we have a skills shortage, just train people up. And as we've talked about before, it has to be done through government because private firms are hopeless at training people up because it's costly, and when they train somebody up, they get pilfered by somebody else. So obviously, training needs to be done by government, and if it's free...
You'll have to run a government deficit probably, Kevin, if you're going to fully subsidised education.
Don't care. Love government deficits, so long as the money is spent on good things like this. That's fine. So after that, we had... I reckon this would be contentious. It was about career paths and training, which what John was saying here was that the job guarantee needs to be run in coordination with these training programs that we're talking about before that need to be free. And that kind of makes sense, but I reckon it could start some arguments with various people in MMT circles. But the whole concept that you might be doing some basic work, which is not very challenging, but you need a pathway to put yourself in a better work position where you might earn more, you might have something which is more suited to your particular skill sets. So, yeah, training needs to be part of that, I guess. And so is that part of the job guarantee program, or is it running in parallel? Or
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what it looks like, because I think we've already got Austudy, so maybe we would just be ramping up Austudy. I don't know.
Yeah. So anyway, whatever it is, it should be free. But there should be a training program that is easily accessible for people who are on a job guarantee so that they can further their working careers.
Absolute.
After that, I've got centralised wage fixing.
I've got that too on my list. Yes.
So right now, I'm up to number 6. Are you up to number 6?
3, 4, 5, yes.
6, okay. So far, we're on par here.
We're in sync here.
You've got 6, I've got 6, so I haven't missed anything yet. Centralised wage fixing, this is probably just a very industrial relations thing, and I haven't really got my head around it.
Well, I think he's talking about that centralised wage fixing as an alternative to this enterprise bargaining that's been going on.
Yeah. Essentially, we're talking about a system whereby it's harder for both workers and employers to understand what the wage is. But it's not something that I feel overly qualified to reflect on, other than to say, I'll take your word for it, John. That sounds like a good idea.
I've got Fair Work inspectors after that.
Okay. I missed out on that one. So, yes, of course, this runs completely counter to the neoliberal agenda, which is to have your workplaces as deregulated and
as uninspected as possible.
Uninspected, so you can exploit your workers as much as possible.
Yes.
So that one is a bit of a no-brainer. Yes, we need to make sure that workplaces are safe and
not exploitative. Yeah.
Not exploitative. Okay, so we agree on that one.
I don't know that you and I are going to disagree with anything John said, but we'll see.
We're reflecting on the things that John said.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then after that, it had the expansion of apprenticeships and cadetships. Have you got that?
Yes, got that one.
Well, if you've got a skills shortage, you need to have better training. I mean, better training just fixes everything up. If everybody is really well trained, then...
It makes sense. If you need workers to do stuff, you need the workers to know how to do the stuff. It's not difficult.
Yeah. And as we've talked about before, a lot of the apprenticeships, because they're run by the employer who is trying to get the best bang for buck, apprenticeships can be a way to engage cheap labour, where you can be just set a single task to do. Say you're working in an apartment building and your job is to cork in the shower screens. So all you do is corking, and you end up being an excellent corker, a corker of a corker, you might say. but that's all you know how to do properly, because that's all you've been doing for the last 3 years in your apprenticeship. You weren't properly trained up. So, yes, expanding apprenticeships and cadetships and making sure that they are thorough. What have you got after that, Anne?
I've got public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
All my P-popping going.
The PPP. And this is a bit of the neoliberal agenda that says that government can't do anything competently by itself. And so if it's going to even try, it needs to have the partnership of private enterprise to make sure that it's going to run efficiently.
Or that the government can't find the money to do things, so it's got to get the private investors in, and then we've got to give the investors a good return.
Yeah, and so we see this with things like tollways, etc. So we're going to be paying tolls for years. None of that's necessary.
No.
The government could have built these freeways, well, they're not freeways, these tollways, and made them freeways.
Sort of like another way of making it more difficult to get to work, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, we're not going to train you, and we're going to make it really expensive for you to go from A to B.
And these are these public-private partnerships, and they're just a great deal for somebody like Transurban. They are making money hand over fist. Well, if a private company can make all this money out of running a road, it's
Should have asked ourselves that 40 years ago, Kevin.
40 years ago. So that's number 9, and the public-private partnerships.
Job guarantee I've got next.
Job guarantee. Okay, rightio. We've talked about job guarantee quite a lot. Let's just refresh listeners' memories. Job guarantee is the government providing work.
Should I pull up a definition?
You can pull one up if you like, and I'll fill in the background music while you're doing it. So anybody's au fait with MMT understands what a job guarantee is, but for the new listener who might not understand, it's where If you want a job, the government will provide you with a job at the minimum
A
wage.
job guarantee, Kevin.
Yes.
The federal government makes an unconditional offer of a job at a socially acceptable, inclusive minimum wage to anyone who is willing to work but can't find work elsewhere. And this job would be funded by the federal government, but probably administered by local authorities like local governments.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before. The care economy is a no-brainer for this sort of work, but it could be environmental stuff. It could be anything that you can think of that needs doing locally. I like the one that Bill used to pull out of his back pocket, which was that if you're a surfy bum, all of a sudden you're a beach inspector. You're making sure the beach is clean. You're making sure that nobody drowns. You might get some basic training.
Yep.
You're on the job guarantee. So enjoy your day.
Absolutely.
And then the last on the list of the 11 things was the Green New Deal.
Yes. A whole bunch of things in itself. It will be a whole lot of different policies. But the idea is that you are fully funding whatever we need to make this transition.
Yes. Basically, MMT is going to save the world. and quite literally, like if the question is, how do you pay for it? Well, MMT tells you how you pay for it.
That's the part we know.
It's not how do you pay for it. It's how do you mobilise the resources that are required to save the planet and
ourselves.
Yeah, and ourselves.
Yeah, I thought the warning that Martha gave about the fact that we're not doing this training and this vocational education and this tertiary education, that we are so in danger of not having the skills that are needed by workers to do these new kinds of jobs. And I did hear like just an anecdotal example of this person who was on their way from the UK to Australia to manage some kind of renewable energy thing. Before they even got here, they were poached by the Americans offering them a better salary. Oh. And I thought, we obviously don't have enough people with certain kinds of skills. Well, John, is there anything else you'd like to say about full employment policies?
No, that's really it. Those are the 11 things, none of which were in the job summary.
Okay.
And actually, I wrote this article before it started.
Right.
I am confident I can predict that none of these, especially the reconceptuation of the public sector, will come out of this week's job summit. And you know what? I was 100% right.
What do you put your powers of prediction down to?
Just studying the neoliberal mindset.
Those 11 points, what they sort of say to me is that managing an economy, in order to have the outcome of full employment, it's going to create an entire paradigm shift in understanding the role of government and how an economy works.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what Martha said. Literally, I think she referred to it as huge structural changes in the way we manage our economy, which neither of us can see the existing parties. Nobody votes for small parties. I take the perspective, if you vote for these small parties, at least there's a chance that they will get some of the money from AEC, even though the vote went on to another party. So it means that they can afford to advertise better and produce better results. I mean, Europe does it all the time. Small parties come from nothing and run the country, whereas here in Australia, we're just so utterly conservative.
It is going to take some kind of political activity then to make this shift and have an economy that is decarbonising, degrowing and has full employment. And Kev and I often go to the pub and meet up with like minds in Melbourne. And there are lots of ideas bubbling around about how are we going to join forces and campaign on these things. I'm just wondering any advice and what kind of opposition you could see them encountering.
Look, we did it for 2.5 years. We met every weekend online to try and get the Real Democracy Party up. I ran some of the Facebook pages, Twitter, where I wrote articles. It was exhausting work, and it's the second party that I've helped to build, the Arts Party being the first one, which was successful. I then went on with the Real Democracy Group thinking, just going to replicate the same thing we did with the Arts Party. It just, I don't know, economics is And an MMT, people just it's a uphill battle to get people to understand the importance of economics to building a better life in Australia. If you've come up with better strategies, then good on you.
So, John, it's been terrific speaking with you. You are a wealth of information. So thank you very much for your time today with Radio MMT.
Okay, right.
And thank you very much for joining us, Martha.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I've really enjoyed speaking with both of you, Anne and Kevin, today.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks, Martha. Lovely to hear from you. So it was interesting hearing from John and Martha. They are very well informed. Actually, one thing I was quite pleased about was John, he was talking about politics and the independent parties, and he didn't know that I was involved with the Australian Workers' Party. And I asked him about, what did you think of the Australian Workers' Party? And he really liked them. And I thought,
what was going on with your profile that someone could vote for the party and they never heard of you? I guess he's in New South Wales and you're in Victoria.
Well, look, the other thing was I had to step aside to get above the line. This was the 2019 federal election. You have to have more than one person. And originally we had to have 3 people register for the Australian Workers' Party, and that gives you a party status above the line.
Okay.
So then they reduced it to 2. And you've got to pay $2,000 per candidate, which is hefty.
You can't just be doing it as a frivolous thing, can you?
Yeah, you've got to try and fundraise. We're only a small party, so it's a lot of money.
I like John's point that he votes for the small parties so that they'll get funding from the Australian Electoral Commission.
That's really important because there's a threshold that you have to meet before you get any refund from the Australian Electoral Commission. And I don't think we met it. And the Australian Workers' Party did pretty well. But, there'll be dozens of parties, small ones, all pinching votes from each other. So the whole political thing is kind of interesting. It seems that to get change, we need to become politically active. But my experience is to become directly politically involved is incredibly difficult. You've got to start a party, you've got to get membership, you've got to go through this whole rigmarole.
It's a long haul, isn't it?
A long haul. The system is set up so that minor parties do not stand a chance in hell of getting their foot in the door unless it's some sort of fluke or unless they've got some sort of celebrity candidate. So it's a long, arduous and probably fruitless venture. So the conclusion I've come to is rather than be directly politically involved, lobby, put pressure on political parties. That's where we as a collective should be organising and putting pressure on all the political parties to listen to what we have to say.
Well, that's interesting that you have a strategy, Kevin, because there is a lot of energy starting to bubble up around Melbourne for sure about starting some campaigning around this issue of how do we manage the economy much better than we do now.
I think if anybody out there can do it, start to pester the independents, the Teals, Pocock, Lambie down in Tassie, because I think the next election is going to see a deterioration of the ALP seats, and I can't see a lot of them going to the coalition. I think the independents are going to become more and more prominent and may end up holding the balance of power even in the House of Representatives. So if we end up with a hung parliament and independents holding the balance of power, and those independents are MMT savvy or economically savvy.
That's what I was just thinking.
And progressive, they'll have a lot of influence. And so rather than waste your time trying to convince the coalition to listen to what we have to say, and Labor aren't brave enough to publicly endorse what we say, even though we know that some of their members of parliament know and understand what we're talking about, they're basically being gagged, as have the Greens. The Greens are pretty much in the same boat. They are too scared to be seen as politically
too radical
with MMT, even though there's nothing radical about MMT. It just describes how the system works. It just looks at it in a more truthful way.
It's radical for a neoliberal.
Yeah, true. It's a challenge to the orthodoxy.
So what you're saying is we need to influence the influencers.
Correct. And I think the easiest and the most effective way to do that is to get the independents, all these people who might be sitting on the crossbench, who seem far more receptive. They're not bound by party lines. They are able to think more freely. If they could become educated and understood the economy as we do through an MMT lens, they could be quite influential and quite powerful in progressive policy.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to our full employment economy, Kevin. I can't wait. So for all those activists to get going on this, I just say release the hounds.
Release the hounds and pressure your local, especially if it's an independent MP, because to me that seems the most effective way to get change.
Well, on that note of advice, Kevin, we do need to get going here.
Radio, nice to do a show with you again, and let's do it again in a couple of weeks' time. You've been listening to Radio MMT. Up next is Mafalda. See you later.
See you then, Kevin. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the Permanent Income Hypothesis, or the Ricardian Equivalence, or Rational Expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.